Well, greetings, Pastor Ethan here from Leroy Covenant Church. It's a beautiful spring day outside today, and so we thought we'd film one of these outside and get some beautiful background here. But today we are looking at 2 Corinthians chapter 10. In our this next video in the series here, we're getting close towards the end, but these last three chapters, 10, 11, 12, well, and actually 13 as well, even though it's kind of a closing chapter, we see a change in tone in Paul's letter, and we see him getting to just kind of a new degree of depth and a new degree of probably emotions, you could say, that are involved here. Because we can't forget that this congregation is very near and dear to him. He was their spiritual father. He planted the church. He spent time there. He visited them multiple times. He cares for them. And we really have at stake the souls and lives of these people, their eternal destiny, and as well as the light that they are being or not being to the city of Corinth and to all Christians that hear about them. So this is a really big deal. So we're in the first 9 chapters. Paul addresses the people there in the church in a certain way, with a certain level of, some tough love, but really on more of a line of care and concern and love. We're going to see that tone change here, especially in chapter 10 and 11, where it's going to be much stronger language that he is going to use to address not just some people that are in the church, but also some of specifically these false teachers or false missionaries or these false apostles, as he calls them, that are coming into this church that are really preaching what he will say in chapter 11 as a different gospel, a different Jesus than what they had first heard. And guess what? Some of them, we don't know exact number, but are buying into it. They are leaving behind the message and the truth that Paul taught them and are starting to listen to them. So here he's going to change things quite a bit. But this has given some commentators and scholars some trouble, because they wonder, how does chapter 10 and 11 and 12 fit in with the 9 chapters before? Because it seems very different. So there are some who believe that this last part, chapters 10 through 13, were actually a part of that third letter we called the severe letter that was written before this letter to the Corinthians, and that it was just attached here later on to complete the work. Some people hold to that, some people don't. And some people believe in the unity of the entire letter, and I would say, because this seems to be more of the tradition of the church, that is one that I'm going to take to see this letter as a whole. And because there are some ways that you can explain this change in tone, some of them could be that he had written the first 9 chapters, and at some point in time, during that period of time, he got news from Corinth that things were getting worse there, and thus he changed his tone, and that's why we have a change. Because we've talked about before in previous videos that chances are Paul did not sit down like in one setting within 2 hours or whatever and write this letter. It probably took some time. That's one explanation. Another one was that Timothy was with him in Macedonia, and maybe Timothy had left to go ahead of him, and maybe he was now alone, and Timothy could possibly have been his scribe, and maybe now he feels like he can become more intimate or say some stuff he didn't say before, or even possibly just on a literary level, just he wanted to save this for the last piece. He had this in mind the entire time of what he was going to write. So whatever it was, we are going to take it as a whole and deal with it that. But no matter how you deal with it, it still is some information here in the way he talks about it that we have to address, because it is a big difference. So Paul is going to start to zero in on his upcoming visit, that he is going to make his third and final visit to the Corinthians. But before he does that, Titus is going to go ahead of him. Some other people are going to go ahead of him. This delegation's going to go before he goes. But he's going to start zeroing in on that this time is coming up and he wants to find them being faithful to Jesus Christ, because if not, he's going to come and there's going to be discipline, and it's not going to be easy for them. Remember, Paul is an apostle commissioned by the risen Lord Jesus Christ, right? He carries authority with him. But we find out in chapter 11, this will help us color in chapter 10 here, that these opponents that Paul is specifically addressing in this letter are Jewish Christians that are very boastful in their ancestry and pedigree, in their achievements, in their spiritual experiences, these extra spiritual things, signs and wonders that maybe they performed. And then also that they possibly had known Jesus during his life, and so that was a claim to fame to them as well. But come chapter 11, Paul is going to have some very harsh words for them. He's going to call them false apostles, deceitful workers, masquerading as apostles of Christ. In other words, they are being like Satan. They are masquerading, meaning that they are trying to act like, but in reality they're not. They're deceitful, they're false. And so sometimes it's even translated they're servants of Satan. So really scary language. And so the situation here is very dire. It's very important. But Paul is going to direct some of this wording to defending himself. It's not a tit for tat, but for the sake of their salvation, for the truth of the gospel. Because if they call into question his apostolic calling, basically they're calling in question his faith in Jesus Christ. And if they deny Paul, they're basically denying their faith in Jesus as well. So this is a big deal about how they see Paul. But he says that his goal here is to build them up, not tear them down. But he's going to use a lot of sarcasm to try. He's going to kind of go down to their level to try to shake them up so that they turn around. And the way the letter starts off is Paul talks about these people, though, in indirect ways. So he says, some people, anyone, some say, such people. He doesn't specifically name them, which is probably a good thing that he does not, a tactful way of doing it. So with all that being said, let's jump into verse 1 and try to go through this quickly. In Greek, the sentence starts off with, I, Paul. This only shows up 4 other times in all of his letters, so this is significant. He urges them, he's going to really say, look, it's me, Paul, and I'm going to start off by starting this section here by saying, by the means of or the basis of the humility of Christ, I appeal to you. I, Paul, what we just talked about, who am timid when face to face with you, but bold toward you when away. So he's being sarcastic here, but by this humility, it's like a gentle or friendly disposition. By this humility and gentleness or forbearing disposition or graciousness of Christ. So the humility and gentleness of Christ, and Christ the Messiah would be the example of that, the perfect example of it. On the basis of that, I appeal to you, I urge you, I entreat you, right? He's appealing with patient restraint without pronouncing judgment. But this doesn't mean he condones their sin. Jesus was meek, but he didn't just say sin was okay. Same thing with Paul here. He says, I who am timid, feeble, subservient, when face to face, probably thinking back to this painful visit he had with them, but bold toward you when I'm away. So bold is like self-confidence, audacity. That's what he's saying. That's what they're accusing him. Timid and bold are these phrases that his opponents are using to describe him. But ironically, Paul being somewhat timid in his visit is actually an act of mercy because he could come with discipline, and that's what he's promising that he's going to do if they don't change their ways. Okay, and humility and gentleness, though, was seen as a sign of weakness by many false teachers and by these false teachers. But it's the attitude of Christ, it's the attitude of Paul. But he's also going to say, I do come with apostolic authority, though. Just like with Jesus Christ, he may be humble and meek, but he's the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. So in verse 2, at the beginning of it, the NIV doesn't have it, but there's like this yes saying. So yes, I beg you. This is not a command. It's an ask, right? That when I beg you that when I come, his next visit, I may not have to be as bold as I expect to be toward some people, right, who think or who reckon, who consider that we live by the standards of the world. In Greek, it's walking according to the flesh, or as one commentator says, worldly principles. The idea here, or the charge against Paul, is that he lives life away from the Spirit. So he's going to admit that he lives in the world like the rest of the world does. How can he not? But he does live with the Spirit. He fights the battles of this world in a spiritual sense with the power of the Spirit. So in Greek, verse 3 starts off, for in the flesh, though we live in the world, right, or in the flesh, we do not wage war. We don't advance like an army, is the way you could say that, as the world or as the flesh does. We don't use human methods. We don't do human resources, right? But then what does Paul use? Well, verse 4, the weapons we fight with are not the weapons of the world. On the contrary, they have divine power to demolish strongholds. So in that verse, the weapons most people think are the Holy Spirit, the fruits of the Spirit type of thing. On the contrary, these weapons right now in the present tense have the divine power, or they are powerful for God to demolish fortresses, to demolish strongholds, like to put a siege works up against a fortress and to tear it down. These are not human weapons. They are of God, they're from God, they're in God, they're for a purpose, and that purpose is to destroy arguments and pretenses or arrogant thinking, right? So the Corinthians need total obedience to Christ. If the actions and knowledge of the enemies, if not, then the actions of his opponents, they're going to be destroyed. So verse 5, we demolish arguments. That argument word there is implied, but that's the idea. And every pretension, every arrogance, that's what we talked about, is being demolished, that sets itself up or raises itself up against the knowledge of God, right? And we take captive, it's like a prisoner of war term, every thought to make it obedient to Christ. So what we think about, the mind, and what we talk about, and this arrogance that people might have, it's a big deal. It matters. And Paul is like, hey, we are after that to completely destroy it. And we're going to turn it around so that anything that sets itself up against God or up against Christ, we're going to tear it down, and we are going to make ourselves instead obedient to Jesus Christ. The mind matters what you think about, right? So verse 6, and we will be ready to punish every act of disobedience once your obedience is fulfilled. So for those that disobey, Paul is probably referring to those out of the congregation, and those that obey, the Corinthians in the congregation that believe. So Paul wants to not be a disciplinarian, but he uses the stern approach to warn them, right? He says, we are ready. Right now, we are ready to punish or avenge every act of anything of disobedience, right? So the Corinthians were fascinated by outward appearances. So they were judging Paul on his speech, on his demeanor, but not on the spirit. So his opponents had all of that outward stuff, but Paul is going to focus on the spirit. But he kind of faces a catch-22, as one commentary says. If he's going to downplay his credentials, his genuineness is going to be questioned. But if he emphasizes his apostolic authority and uses it, he's going to be accused of being overly boastful, right? But we have to remember, again, he is commissioned by the Lord Jesus Christ, and God gave him this authority for building them up. So verse 7 in the NIV translates, you are judging by appearances. If anyone is confident that they belong to Christ, they should consider that we belong to Christ just as much as they do. But in Greek, that first part of the sentence is very different. So it could maybe be translated as look, exclamation point, or look at what is before your face. Or the Good News Bible translates it as you are looking at the outward appearance of things. Okay? If anyone is confident that they belong to Christ, we do as well. He's a commissioned apostle of Jesus. So even if Paul says, I boast or glory somewhat freely, or even more about the authority God gave me that came from him for building you up rather than you tearing you down, I'm not ashamed of it. Now, if you go back to Jeremiah's ministry was primarily of kind of tearing down, of bringing judgment. But Paul says here, my my job, my commission by the Lord is to build you up into Christ and to make you holy, present you holy before Christ. And we're going to get that in chapter 11 as well. Verse 9, I don't want to seem or appear as if I'm trying to frighten you. And that word is a very strong Greek word. Terrify is a better word. I'm not trying to terrify you with my letters. Paul is more saying what I want is obedience to Christ. Verse 10, for some say his letters are weighty, they're severe, they're heavy, they're burdensome, and they're forceful, they're violent, they're loud. But in person, he is unimpressive. This is a word for like weakness, but it comes from a word that means like physically sick. And his speaking amounts to nothing. Or in other words, his words are despised, they're contemptible, right? So Paul would have known some about rhetoric and elegance. He didn't have the official training like maybe these false apostles and teachers did, but he was a competent speaker. But he wasn't focused on externals like they were. They wanted Paul to have all this list of shining recommendations and letters and these credentials and all these ways that he lived out in powers and signs and wonders. But Paul was taking a much humbler approach. But he's basically saying, look, you guys think that this is the way I am. But what he says in verse 11, such people should realize that what we are in our letters, hey, we are in present as well. So what comes next is the false teachers were not concerned about the actual spiritual warfare and love of the Corinthians, right? So verses 12 through 8 are going to be bookmarked, or bookended, I guess you could say, by comparing themselves with themselves comments. So Paul does not relate to Paul does not relate to those who commend themselves, but those who are commended by the Lord. So it is the one who is not commended by man, but by the Lord who is approved. But there is one way in which Paul is going to concede that he's like these people, that he's in their same class, is that that he is timid in a way, but he's doing it to not bring them judgment. So verse 10, we dare not classify, this is a very rare Greek word, it means to admit or to accept into the same rank or class, or compare ourselves with those who commend themselves. So there's two types of commendations. Negative, that you impress people with all your achievements and abilities and your pedigree, and then there's one that's positive, one that aims to stimulate excellent behavior, as one commentary says, and this is what Paul is after. When they measure themselves by themselves, and compare themselves with themselves, they are not wise. They're actually without understanding, that Greek can be translated. So this is a false standard. You don't compare yourself with yourself. That's ridiculous. The appropriate measure for comparing yourself is from God, right? So verse 13, we, however, will not boast beyond our proper limits, but will confine our boasting, some boasting according to Paul is good, to the sphere of service. Now that is a very loaded and complicated phrase. What does that mean? It could be a lot. It could mean domain. It can mean limit, province, jurisdiction, assignment. More or less, it's a geographical kind of an area. God himself assigned to us a sphere that includes you. So Paul was set aside at a specific time. He was commissioned by God, and then he was sent out by the church in Jerusalem to go spread the gospel among the Gentiles. And this was recognized and endorsed by the leaders in Jerusalem, James and Peter and John. You can find that in Galatians chapter 2, verse 9. So he had a specific ministry to start churches to evangelize specifically to Gentiles. And this area, geographically, or just as the command said, included Corinth, and that's what he was doing here. He was not beyond his limits. This was his place. This was his authority. But the false teachers are saying, no, this is our place. This is our authority. We're the ones who are in charge here. Paul's like, that's not how it works. So verse 14, we are not going too far in our boasting, as would be the case if we had not come to you. For we did get, or we were the first, you can also translate that, as to get as far as you with the gospel of Christ. But he says, neither do we go beyond our limits of boasting of the work done by others. So interesting enough, it seems like Peter, according to some passages in 1 Corinthians, had also done some ministry in Corinth as well. So Paul's like, hey, I'm not going beyond my limit here. I recognize some other people that did work, maybe it was Peter or whatnot, but more or less this is our town here. He needed and wanted to complete this work that he began there, that he started there. So our hope, as the verse goes on, is that your faith continues to grow. That is the main point here. It increases. And then our sphere of activity, there's that same word, that limit, domain, among you will greatly expand, or expand abundantly, super abundantly will expand, to the point that it overflows. So if the Corinthians don't back him here, Paul can't finish his work, and then Paul cannot move on in his evangelistic work. So it's so important that they get this message and that they learn and that they obey so Paul can keep going forward. So, verse 16, we can preach the gospel in the regions beyond you. So hopefully, maybe geographically, but also more strategically, that he can start planning on what's going to come next and maybe bring that work to further parts or to other populations. Verse 16, for we do not want to boast about work already done in someone else's territory or limit or domain. And there's that word again. But rather, verse 17, let the one who boasts boast in the Lord, Jesus Christ. You can imply that. So that original phrase comes from Jeremiah chapter 9, verse 23. So boasting is okay when it comes to the Lord, or it comes from the Lord when it's about the Lord. The NIV application commentary says, to boast in the Lord is to exalt in what the grace of God has accomplished in one's life. Not to be like, look at me and all that I've done, right? It's about this humility before Jesus Christ, and it's all about him, which his opponents did not have. So he ends this chapter by saying, for it is not the one who commends himself who is approved, but the one whom the Lord commends for being a faithful follower of Jesus Christ. So do you see how beautifully he writes this, that he's kind of on the attack and the offensive, but he isn't that cutting down. He's being very tactful of how he says this, and he's trying to use this argument and trying to get them to realize that he qualifies as well, that they are very dear to him, and he's going to say more about that in the next chapter. And the Lord has called him to this ministry, and he is boasting only in the Lord, not beyond his authority. And so therefore he's very much unlike those false teachers and apostles that have tried to work their way in. So that's what I have for you guys today. I hope it was meaningful. Chapter 11 will start to answer more and more questions that you probably found in this area. But very interesting stuff, and we'll continue that on our next video. So God's grace and peace to you. Amen.